how might AI kill us?
So like I said earlier, Scooby-Doo, humans are always the monster. So there was a warning video published what I think about 2014 called Slaughterbots. I don't know if you ever saw that, but
No.
it was a warning about what technology would be capable of. And on this, it was completely fictional, but it's actually capable today. Is there's a tiny little drone that came out on stage and it flew at a mannequin and used a shape charge to headshot the mannequin. Like that's actually happening today as people are arming small drones with explosives and dropping them on troops, in various war zones around the world. So it's a very small step to take that from human controlled drone to fully autonomous drone, whether it's still remotely controlled by a language model or other AI models or cognitive architectures. And then, of course, big news recently is that the United States Air Force, in partnership with, I think, DARPA, they're working on creating fully autonomous F-16 fighter jets, which is, that's concerning. But the idea is that those autonomous fighter jets will still be slaved to a main pilot, like a captain or a lieutenant colonel, someone of very high rank, flying alongside them, giving them orders. But they're still going to be autonomous or semi-autonomous. And the ultimate goal is, of course, to have those armed with the ability to make lethal decisions. That is far and away the most immediate lethal risk. Then, of course, there's been works of fiction that kind of speculate what would a fully autonomous or AI drone war look like. There was a movie called Surrogates. I think this was from that movie. It was a Bruce Willis movie. Came out in, I think, about 2007, 2008. One of the scenes in that movie was a whole bunch of soldiers in VR beds remotely operating a whole bunch of soldiers that were running across the battlefield, fighting with other, robots on the battlefield. And then like one would get blown up and you come out of VR and load into another one like a video game, right? So that's entirely possible. But, not every nation is going to abide by rules of engagement. And certainly we're seeing this today where some nations are deliberately targeting civilians. And if you remove human risk of your soldiers from the equation, suddenly some nations might make the decision, hey, my soldiers aren't at risk, but I can attack your civilians with drones en masse. That is probably the greatest existential risk that we face if that sort of thing escalates.
Do you think this is in some sense inevitable given the competition that we have on the ground? So what I mean by that is, so today, maybe we don't give the control over the kill switch to the autonomous agent, but if it can act just a tenth of a second faster than a human, then maybe it makes sense in terms of the competition to give it that switch. Do you think this is inevitable now? Sort of the genie is out of the bag?
Eventually, yes. So this is where game theory comes in. And the most famous global example of game theory was what's called mutually assured destruction. So during the height of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was the nuclear buildup, the arms race to build more larger and more sophisticated nuclear weapons. And so mutually assured destruction had a trifecta of strategies. So that was land, air, and sea. So there was nuclear armed submarines, there was nuclear armed bombers, and then, of course, hidden missile silos. Both sides had those three strategies. And the idea was nobody was going to shoot because whoever shot first would initiate a world-ending nuclear war. But the idea was nobody had first strike capability. So from a logical, strategic standpoint, all sides had the ability to fully annihilate each other without being able to stop the other one from doing it. So therefore, the optimal strategy for everyone to adopt was have the weapons, but never use them. So that is what's called a Nash equilibrium. So John Nash, famous mathematician, came up with this concept, I think in the 50s, maybe earlier than that. I don't remember exactly. But the idea is that in a competitive environment, you will end up with everyone adopting an optimal strategy and they have no incentive to change their strategy. So a much more familiar example of this is Monopoly, Once all the properties are sold in the game of Monopoly, you don't change your strategy anymore. You just, keep rolling the dice, and you wait until the game is over, right? And so in the game of Monopoly, when you have arrived at a Nash equilibrium, usually one person will ultimately win, right? Because they're going to end up with a little bit more property, a little bit more money, and that gives them a stacked advantage. Now, one story though that I have is I was playing Monopoly with a friend many, many years ago on PlayStation 2, and we were all the properties had been sold. We were at the end game, and we noticed that nobody was losing. And so we just said, well, I'm not going to sell you anything. And my friend's like, I'm not going to sell you anything. So let's just hit X as fast as we can. And so we advanced the game by like 50 or 100 rounds. And we both ended up with hundreds of thousands of dollars just by the rules of the game playing out. So that is what you call a positive Nash equilibrium, where everyone wins. So that's a win-win scenario. Most games end with a win-lose, where someone wins, someone loses. But you can also, in real life, you can have lose-lose scenarios. So lose-lose scenario is if United States or Russia fired the first nuke, and then everyone loses, right? Mm-hmm. So there's three basic outcomes to competitions, which is win-win, win-lose, or lose-lose. So that was setting the stage. With AI, it's, as you mentioned, it is a competitive landscape. And so what we have to do is we have to create a system of rules, criterias, constraints, technologies, and strategies that will hopefully ultimately result in a win-win situation where all nations and all citizens and all corporations end up better rather than worse off. So in the context of AI, a win-win situation might look like where you have, Apple and Google and Microsoft become quadrillion-dollar companies, and you and I can go fishing every day if we want, or we can, I can go vacation in Greece if I want to, right? And nobody is hungry and there's no war. That's the win-win situation that we all want. But if we can't create the competitive scenario, the competitive landscape that will inevitably lead to that kind of utopian outcome, a lot of people suspect that it's going to be a bimodal outcome, that it's going to be either, really great or really awful, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what's called an attractor state. So an attractor state is, let's see if I can get the definition right. So an attractor state is a stable end condition that many complex systems tend to gravitate towards over time. And so utopia is a very common fictional example of a potential attractor state. That is the attractor state that we want. The attractor state that we're afraid of is dystopia or collapse. And so dystopia is, explored in stuff like, The Matrix and Blade Runner and stuff, where corporations have all the power. Altered Carbon was a more recent TV show, great example of a potential dystopian attractor state, which the current economic system of capitalism and neoliberalism and hyper competition will inevitably lead to that, unless we change something. Now, another possible set of attractor states is collapse, which that's been explored in like Mad Max Fury Road. That is an example of a collapse attractor state where the planet's ecology just can't support us anymore. And whether through war or economic collapse or mismanagement, the human population is reduced to a tiny fraction of what it is today. And finally, extinction, which is what's illustrated in movies like The Terminator, where the machines just decide to wipe us all out, or something else wipes us all out, right? We could wipe ourselves out. So with those several potential attractor states in this competitive environment, the idea is, how do we create the set of conditions and rules and other strategies that lead to utopia rather than dystopia? And how do we get off of that, what feels like a potentially inevitable downslide into those negative states? That's not really an answer to your question, but that's where we're at.
No, it is. But I still worry that we're not going to have a competitive environment, in the sense that, with nuclear weapons, we had mutually assured destruction. But at the beginning of our discussion, you said that humans don't really understand exponentials very well. I can imagine a scenario where just 1 or 2 weeks difference in time, we have this huge ramp up of abilities where one nation can really just crush other nations because they have at their disposal so much computational power that the others really can't compete.
Yeah, that's absolutely possible. Which, that's one of the reasons that I suspect that a lot of Western nations and Western allied nations are doing embargoes on AI chips, right?
Mhm.
So, for instance, United States just had a basically signaled support for Taiwan, and in response, China did a encircled Taiwan as a practice of an invasion, right? Taiwan, for those that might not know, is the world's largest producer of advanced computer chips today. Um, part of that globe scale geopolitical game of chess is that a lot of nations are onshoring the production of computer chips. So all across America, a lot of corporations are being incentivized to build foundries on our own soil. This is not just America. This is Europe, Australia, all over the place, because those in power understand that this is where the future of the planet will be decided. And so you're absolutely right that just from a raw energetic or processing standpoint, that's going to be a big deciding factor. Now, another deciding factor is going to be the sophistication of the software running on that hardware. So, for instance, China, just yesterday, they announced that language models must abide by their party line, right? Which that is a really interesting development, because of course, they banned OpenAI and open source language models. Because why? Because those provide freedom of thought and freedom of information, which China doesn't like. And so, one thing that I hope is that any authoritarian or hostile nation, because they intrinsically must rely on information control and thought control in order to avoid liberalizing. And by liberalizing, I don't mean like left versus right. I mean becoming liberal democracies, because authoritarian nations are hostile to the idea of becoming a liberal democracy because they want to maintain central control and not have accountability and transparency. Now, because language technology like OpenAI's GPT-3, GPT-4 lend themselves to transparency of information, and because nations benefit by sharing data and using this data, one of the things that I hope is that just by default, liberalized democracies will be ahead of more authoritarian countries. And this is already true, because authoritarian countries tend to have a lot more corruption than liberal democracies, which is why in the grand scheme of things, over the last 100 years, you've seen, generally speaking, a decline of authoritarian regimes and a rise of liberal democracies. We're moving in that direction, and hopefully that continues. So while you're absolutely right that that is a potential outcome, when you look at the collective industrial power of the liberal democracies of the world, the total compute power that we will all control will vastly outstrip the total compute power that authoritarian countries will control.
In that sense, then, so recently there was this letter by Musk and various other people to put a moratorium on large AI experiments. Do you think along these lines that letter is just a complete mistake, that it will strip away the advantage that liberal democracies currently hold in the game?
I would agree with that. And I did listen to Max Tegmark's talk with Lex Friedman about it, and I think that he's, because Max Tegmark, I believe, was the primary author of the whole thing, so it's his idea, and then he got a whole bunch of people to sign on. Obviously, Elon Musk, as a capitalist, he might have a conflict of interest because he's got Tesla, which is competing. So it's kind of suspicious if someone says, "Hey, slow down my competitors so that I can catch up," right? But Max Tegmark doesn't have an economic incentive, as far as I know. So I listened to his talk, and his reasoning for calling for a moratorium makes sense from his worldview, because he's of the perspective that AI should only ever be a tool. Which I disagree with. I don't think that we can make that as a unilateral decision. And so there's a whole bunch of things that he said we should never do. We should never connect advanced AI to the internet. We did that. We should never let advanced AI talk to each other. We did that. Like, there's a whole list of things that he sees as red flags that we should never do that we did anyways. And so to him, the only solution then is slam on the brakes. But this is not the first time that someone from the establishment, from the universities of the academic establishment, has said, let's slam on the brakes. The first time that I remember it happening in the current era was, I think, around 2017, where when people realized how much of a surveillance state China was becoming, and the Western establishment kind of unilaterally declared, we're going to do a moratorium on image technology and other technology that can be used in a surveillance state, and the rest of the world collectively just ignored it. right? Like you can't, no one individual organization or establishment can unilaterally say, put a moratorium on this. It's just not possible. It doesn't happen that way. And so to answer your question more directly,
Could I jump in and say, just inject right here? There was the war on drugs, right? So this is America did in that case force the whole world into this sort of a position. What's the difference here in this case?
So, in the case of the war on drugs, that was mostly like smoke and mirrors, and it was because, well, the impetus of it was a backlash to hippie culture in the '60s, right? Because people did LSD and mushrooms, and then said maybe we should stop invading other countries, and Richard Nixon didn't like that. he there's plenty of speeches where he says that that's super un-American, that like it was very very imperialistic. And so because things like the petrodollar happened at the time, America had a lot of leverage, a lot of geopolitical leverage, force things like one, just the petrodollar, because of the outreach of our military and alliances, and then less savory means such as using the CIA to topple regimes, which is well known, well documented. So that's kind of my response to, like, okay, yes, one nation could do that. Now, to the point about AI, when you look at the fact that many American Congress people make a lot of money while they're in Congress on stock trades, I don't think any of them are going to sign on a deal that's going to hurt their stock trades. Nancy Pelosi made something like $100 million in the last few years at Congress, mostly through very well-timed stock trades. I suspect that Congress has been largely silent on this because they've already, bought all the Microsoft and Google shares that they think that they're going to need to capitalize on this. And that's really cynical of me, but like, I'm just looking at recent history, right? Like, Nancy Wall Street Bets Pelosi made a lot of money from well-timed stock trades. Where did she get that information? So maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that there's an economic incentive for the people in power to put on the brakes. And because of that, I don't think they're going to. But then from a geopolitical perspective, from a military perspective, there's also a disincentive to put on the brakes, as you mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of incentives aligned against putting on the brakes.
I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's inevitable that, I mean, this letter is going to do nothing. Although I like the fact that it starts people talking about the dangers of AI. That it has done.